Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to have with us Tatiana Chudakova from Tufts University. She did a PhD at Chicago and then worked at Harvard. She did a postdoc there. She's an anthropologist working on Buryat. Her research focuses on how post-socialist economies of health are reshaped through the cultural politics of indigenous knowledge, the remaking of ethno-ecologies, and the commodification of ethnic identities. She's currently working on a book, provisionally titled Rooted: Medical Ecologies and the Politics of Health in Asian Russia, which follows Russia's official medical sector's attempts to reinvent itself through state-led initiatives of medical integration that aim to recuperate indigenous therapeutic traditions associated with the state's ethnic and religious minorities. So please join me in welcoming Tatiana Chudakova.
So this paper is sort of in two parts, and you'll see what I mean when I start talking. So the first part sort of contextualizes something that has been happening in Buryat over the last probably decade, which is this effort centered around coming up with a Buryat brand. And the second part is really sort of more focused on Buryat Buddhism and how it interacts with these commoditization of Buddhism in the region. So without further ado, building on recent anthropological scholarship on, quote, ethno-branding, which focuses on how the concept of ethnicity is transformed as a result of its corporatization and financialization, this paper examines processes that seek to fold cultural religious distinctions into the logics of the market. I track these projects in Buryat, a multi-ethnic region of the Russian Federation located to the east of Lake Baikal on the border with Mongolia. While local efforts that seek to develop Buryatia's regional brand can be found in the predictable spheres of tourism and regional politics, I argue that the hope to transform the marked into the marketable has multiple loci of articulation, as well as distinct social aims and effects for different actors. The first part of this paper situates Buryat Buddhism and its encounter with the market within other local and federal initiatives that seek to envision the region's economic future. The second part focuses on some of the unexpected retoolings of both local and transnational interpretations of Buddhism Inc., or Buddhism Incorporated. So, historically, Buryatia has derived its political status from being home to the Buryat, a Siberian indigenous group that shares many linguistic and cultural similarities with Mongols. Buryat had toggled between the Russian and Manchu empires and were annexed into the Russian Empire in the late 17th century. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, Buryats were the object of state-driven consolidation projects between disparate ethnic and linguistic subgroups. The early 20th century was turbulent for the Buryat and for Russia more generally. At the onset of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Buryatia adopted communism and declared itself a sovereign indigenous state in alliance with the Soviet government. A year later, the Soviet administration was ousted from the territory with the help of Japanese troops, and a dictatorship under the rule of a Kazakh warlord was established. Between 1919 and 1920, Buryatia was the site of three distinct polities: the Buryat Mongol state, the theocratic Bulagat nation, which was a Buddhist theocracy, and the Great Pan-Mongol state. In 1921, the Soviet faction re-established dominance, and the Mongol Buryat Autonomous Region was created as part of the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republic. Throughout the Soviet period, much like other regions with a sizable ethnically and culturally non-Slavic population, Buryatia had a special political status and a certain claim to self-governance. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the region was renamed Republic Buryatia. Since the early 2000s, regional political autonomy progressively decreased following the emphasis on centralization adopted by the Russian federal government. Notably, like other regions of Russia, Buryatia can no longer elect the head of the local government, which is now appointed by Moscow. So, presently, one of the three Buddhist regions of the Russian Federation, Buryatia is marked as a kind of internal cultural other to Russia's admittedly tortured European self-identification. During my fieldwork on Buddhist medical practices from 2006 to the present, Buryatia's cultural and geographic distance from Moscow often came to inform imaginaries of the region's economic trajectory and future development. Centered on developing Buryatia's tourism industry, such efforts at what anthropologists Jean and John Komarov have called Ethnicity Inc. run up against several difficulties. First, they have to make themselves legible to the Russian state's narratives of its national and international identity. In the context of present-day Russia, branding ethnicity is a complicated political gambit, both because the state's self-presentation fluctuates between displays of standardized plurality on the one hand and of radical ideological homogeneity on the other, and because Russia's own international standing and national brand is at best problematic. By looking at an instance of ethno-branding at the edges in a region that has historically been situated at the periphery of several competing spheres of political influence, the paper interrogates how the regimes of value that underpin ethno-branding intersect with the self-conscious politics of marginality. Second, this paper is concerned with the pitfalls of branding the derivative. As anthropological scholarship on branding has noted, brands as semiotic objects tend towards producing excesses, sometimes with uncanny effects. Whether manifested as illegitimate copies, as forgeries, as authentic fakes, or as freestanding labels, to name just a few examples, surfeits are inherent to the semiotic process through which brands come to be, and central to local regimes of social and economic value formation. Building on these insights, we might ask what happens when experiments with ethno-branding are plagued by a concern that the cultural features and practices one wishes to brand have already been appropriated, potentially more successfully elsewhere. How, in other words, is authenticity or its lack made legible under emergent ethno-branding regimes? Third, the production of culture as commodity, or identity as commodity, is a recursive process that both depends on and puts into question such distinctions as producer and consumer, or here and elsewhere. Rather than reading ethno-branding as simply a symptom of a total reconfiguration of political, social, and religious life heralded by the triumph of neoliberalism, or as a subspecies of biocapital where ever new aspects of everyday life and affect are seized for the production of economic value, I argue that experiments with ethno-branding are always reabsorbed into local moral and not just financial economies. So the first sort of section of this paper is about the geopolitics of Buryatia's brand, called The Heart of Russia in Asia. While trade forums and conferences on regional branding in Buryatia were happening as early as 2005, an explicit initiative by the region's new administration to create a, quote, image developing unit, or image, in Russian, image, right? It's a calque. It refers to sort of that essence that is supposed to be associated with a brand. Began in earnest in 2008. In the section, I'm going to focus on some of the debates over formulating Buryatia's identity, articulated during these local professional events. Buryatia's brand, in Russian it's also a calque, it's brand, has featured regularly in the local media, cycling through a variety of possibilities, from Lake Baikal to steamed dumplings, from Buddhism to ice fishing, and is the regular focus of conferences, in particular in the tourist industry, as well as the basis of a genre of news articles in local periodicals. It is useful to remember that ethno-branding takes place in the context of national branding, aimed alternatively at attracting transnational investment capital, tourists, and increasingly at managing one's international standing. In the late 2000s, the main concern in local debates over Buryatia's brand was that the region was largely unknown. Indeed, in 2008, Buryatia's then president Vladimir Nagovitsyn was pointing out that before Buryatia could be turned into an attractive destination for investors and travelers, domestic or otherwise, the administration ought to raise awareness of the region's very existence. He argued that outside of Buryatia, most people still confuse the region's administrative capital Ulan-Ude with Ulaanbaatar. This concern over Buryatia's relative invisibility in other parts of Russia, and especially in European Russia in general and in Moscow in particular, reflects a particular geographic ideology that confines Siberia to an undifferentiated periphery, or peripheria. Distinctions traced along a center-periphery or center-regions dichotomy, much as they have been critiqued by social scientists, are part of a colloquial geopolitical model in Russia, frequently invoked in everyday conversations to account for the country's geography of internal differences and inequalities. Thus, center and periphery are usually framed in a relationship of mutual confrontation, defined either through the prospect of regional secessionism or through the discontent over the direction of economic flows. However reductive, the center-periphery discourse in fact offers a provocative heuristic for understanding the context in which ethno-branding efforts in Russia are taking place. What underpins it is a semiotic interplay between marked and unmarked poles of two mutually calibrated but nonetheless distinct axes: metropolitan identity opposed to undifferentiated provinciality on the one hand, and ethnically unmarked Europeanness opposed to ethnically marked Asianness. The precarious work of aligning these two sets of distinctions has, in recent years, consistently spilled out into a kind of xenophobic rhetoric that is often aggressively ignorant of Russia's own internal pluralism. By 2010, the question of Buryatia's relative invisibility was replaced with a new concern: how to grapple with Russia's national standing. During a conference on the image of Russia and its regions taking place in Ulan-Ude, the participants were lauding the relative success of promoting Buryatia's association with Lake Baikal, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, while reaffirming the necessity of furthering the Republic's attractiveness as a recreational and ecological destination, in particular for Russian tourists. By then, several formulations for defining Buryatia's image had made their way into the media. A description of Ulan-Ude as the heart of Asia in Russia became commonplace, and Buryatia itself was reframed as the, quote, gateway to Asia. Then the formula was reversed, and Buryatia became framed as the heart of Russia in Asia. Anyway. So, despite this proliferation of Buryatia's identification with Asia, some specialists cautioned that any brand development would be taking place in the context of Russia's broader geopolitical reputation, which gave very little cause for optimism. Thus, for example, a Moscow-based political scientist suggested that Russia's image in neighboring China was of, quote, negative, disdainful character. Another participant cited the yearly reports by BBC's Globescan about the international popularity of different states to note somewhat sarcastically that, quote, Russia finds itself as the fifth country from the bottom of the list, outperforming only Iran, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. And I'm sure that status has probably fallen since then. And yet developing a brand that would distance Buryatia from Russia by aligning it more explicitly with either neighboring China or Mongolia had its own perils. One of the local experts on the regional branding expressed his concern that banking on Buryatia's otherness drew attention to its inherently ambiguous marginality. I'm going to quote at length from this person. So, the geopolitical question for the Russian Federation is a sore point. The fact that Buryatia is part of the Mongol world is something that geopolitical analysts feel ambivalent about. Strong connections with Mongolia, China, and Tibet give some reason to talk about separatist tendencies in Buryatia. To reduce these tensions, it would be correct to signal to the federal government that we guarantee Russia's interests. So you'll notice a sort of distancing move that he's making here. These debates point to the complex politics that underpin Buryatia's brand-making initiatives. In order to make Buryatia's distinctiveness legible to prospective tourists and investors, the ethno-brand references pre-existing and long-standing national discourses on Russia's own cultural and political liminality as a, quote, bridge between Europe and Asia. This self-presentation narrates the state's geography as a matter of cultural gradients, where remoteness from the implied centers in European Russia works as value added, but must be managed so that it is not misinterpreted as political risk. While the overt Orientalism of the heart of Russia in Asia formulation, which exploits the implicit opposition between a presumably European Russia and an undifferentiated Asia, might be a readily available marketing strategy, it also delimits what can become an ethno-commodity in the region. Buryatia as the heart of Asia in Russia proposes an Asian experience to domestic tourists without the inconvenience of visas, language barriers, and other hurdles associated with international travel. In this sense, it echoes a Soviet-era aesthetics of geographic and cultural imitation, designed for internal consumption by a population that was severely restricted in its ability to travel. Similarly, Buryatia as the gateway to Asia, another earlier formulation of the region's image, promises an Asian experience to an unmarked Russian subject who is presumably ethnically and culturally European, hailing from one of Russia's western regions, and neither unable or unwilling to travel beyond the state's borders. The invocation of this generic Asia, while indeed making Buryatia more legible to a hypothetical Western consumer, functions such that it presents Buryat culture as commodity as the more accessible knockoff version of an original and abstractly Asian cultural essence. And in this modality, the imagined audience of Buryatia's Asian brand is assumed to follow familiar itineraries of cultural tourism, from west to east, from urban centers to provincial towns, from more wealthy to less wealthy regions. These accountings of geographic space and connections simultaneously articulate with and reproduce specific national narratives. This speak both to a politics of autolectic enclosure, a fantasy of complete self-sufficiency and global uninvolvement, which has a long ideological history in Russia, and echo a particular vision of the frontier or margin as a zone of both ecological and cultural consumption and extraction. Concomitantly, such anticipatory figurations of Buryatia's potential for tourism obscure the complex movements of people and things that already characterize this part of the world. Movements between Siberian regions, such as Buryatia and the Sakha Republic to the north, that bypasses Western Russia entirely, or between Siberian and Far Eastern urban hubs, such as Novosibirsk and Vladivostok. They also obscure the transborder traffic in pursuit of trade, education, and employment between Russia and Mongolia and China, and religious migrations along Buddhist pilgrimage routes. Okay, so now I'm getting to the discussion on Buddhism. So, Buddhism, Inc. Participation in ethno-branding in Buryatia is not necessarily limited to expert-led endeavors undertaken by tourist firms, but it is instead a nebulous and shifting assemblage of multiple actors, many of whom find themselves interpellated to participate in and respond to an already circulating discourse on what constitutes the region's value to an external gaze. Entanglements between post-socialist religious revivals and markets have been widely documented both in Russia and elsewhere. Although Buryatia is a multi-confessional region, the official Buddhist Sangha of Russia, based in Buryatia, has worked to consolidate its association, or Buryatia's association with the Buddhist heritage and tradition. In recent years, it has also argued that the quote autocephalous status quote autocephalous status of Buryat Buddhism, and hence its freedom from foreign influences or hierarchies. For the Sangha, which functions as a consequential voice in both local and to some extent national politics, establishing a symbolic monopoly on Buddhism in Russia is useful both politically and economically. Politically, because equating Buryatia with Buddhism enables an expansion of the Sangha's symbolic authority, and economically, because much of the Sangha's activity is entangled with market logics, and many of the schisms and upheavals the organization has undergone in the post-socialist period has a distinctly economic dimension. While the political goals and visions of the regional administration and of the Sangha have not always aligned, both have actively and to a large degree successfully promoted the sense that Buryat Buddhism is not only a religious and moral, but also an economic force shaping the region. And to be sure, banking on a local Buddhist heritage is risky business, in that Buddhism already operates as a cosmopolitan commodity in a global spiritual marketplace. Hence, Ole Needle right here. However, the labor of connecting Buryatia's image with a particular vision of Buddhism is an endeavor in which a number of local organizations participate, even when they are not, in fact, aligned with the Sangha's agendas. For example, the local traditional medicine hospital that became one of my focal sites during my fieldwork took on the role of tour guide for international colleagues, high-ranking patients, and visiting dignitaries that came for treatment. It therefore interspersed its more specific medical offerings with guided tours that incorporated a Buddhist temple visit and trips to see local Buddhist artifacts, which is a little strange for a clinic that very actively claims that Tibetan medicine or the medicine that they practice has nothing to do with Buddhism, or it has little to do with Buddhism. So the cartographic imaginaries of what is and is not worth showing go hand in glove with other top-down initiatives to promote certain aspects of Buryat Buddhism but not others. Not all temples are seen as worthy of outside visitors, and many of the Buddhist communes that are unaffiliated with the Sangha are not housed in architecturally distinct buildings that appropriately index Buryatia's Asianness. This occlusion, in turn, creates a homogeneous sense of Buryat Buddhism that does not reflect its internal fractures and tensions, which are quite important for local religious pursuits. They also do not reflect how participation in local tourist logic and practices often addresses and mediates between multiple, sometimes disconnected audiences. Both local organizations and individuals frequently enter Buryatia's tourist economy as purveyors of a type of effective labor, and as themselves producers and promoters of a particular vision of Buryatia's image. These forms of participation are often framed as a sign of being good hosts, or гостеприимство, right? So ferrying their visitors around Ulan-Ude or the countryside is a common way of passing the time with one's guests, and a practice that intersects with the long-standing Soviet-era tradition of amateur regional studies that used to be cultivated in school curricula and local museums. Such excursions serve multiple purposes, since they are occasions for perpetuating exchange relationships with non-human beings that inhabit Buryatia's landscape. In particular, travel across specific sacred sites, such as called Obo and Buryat, for example, mountain passes and streams, demands donation to local place spirits, savdak, as a token of safe passage. While tourists might be officially recruited in these actions, framed as, quote, ethnographic information about local customs, the implications of not following proper etiquette towards the local spirits can have dire consequences for both outsiders and locals. In multiple conversations with my Buryat friends and interlocutors, explanations for car accidents and other random fatalities were framed as a breach of proper comportment towards these local non-human hosts. More often than not, if the accident involved tourists, ignorance of an Obo figured as the primary cause. So this brings me to scarce sacralities, or this question of religious scarcity in Buryatia. In this section, I explore the sense of a scarcity that arises at the site of encounter between Buddhism, neoliberal market logics, and memories of individual and collective Soviet histories. During my research, queuing for hours to obtain sacred objects and services was a perfectly ordinary undertaking, despite the market's visible saturation with religious commodities. Buddhist lectures and empowerments regularly sold out, despite the long waits and prohibitive price tag. Ritual objects, from the mass-produced colored scarves or hadak used for offering in both Buddhist and shamanist rites, to various amulets, prayer beads, incense burners, deity statuettes, tanka postcards, and dashboard prayer wheels, crowded the shelves of temple gift shops and downtown art galleries. They also coexisted with other examples of national or ethnic arts sold along Buryatia's tourist circuits, such that the ritually efficacious objects and the mass-produced tchotchkes aimed at tourists shared a messy, ambiguous boundary. Faced with the abundance of this mass-produced religious kitsch, my Buryat interlocutors bemoaned a sense of scarcity of truly powerful objects and spiritual teachers, what a friend and local Buddhist scholar described to me as a, quote, blessing deficit. A particular incident might help illustrate the tensions between this contrasting experience of excess and scarcity in everyday Buryat Buddhism. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about this photograph here. The crowd in front of the Sampilov Art Museum snaked raggedly down the building's well-worn concrete steps, constantly threatening to spill beyond the temporary aluminum railing that attempted to contain it, and looped along the small street towards Ulan-Ude pedestrian artery with its touristy cafes, clothing boutiques, and mobile phone stores. By 10 a.m. on a cool September morning, the line had swelled to several hundred people, but the museum's main doors remained closed. Uniformed policemen overlooked the crowd from the Soviet structure's elevated porch, occasionally wandering off to smoke a cigarette or make a phone call. Such massive gatherings, unusual for the local art museum, are actually quite typical for Ulan-Ude's religious events. A section of the museum had been repurposed to house the sand mandala of Otosho Baksha, or Medicine Buddha. The mandala, assembled over several days by 6 monks from Buryatia's largest Buddhist temple, became a site of worship for the local Buddhist community. Considered considered to be the temporarily earthly manifestation of the medicine Buddha's realm, this mandala also concentrated sacredness into its material substance. Upon its ritual deconstruction, the karmic benefit accumulated through its creation and worship would be released. The queue had formed because those desires to obtain a small packet of sand from the soon-to-be-destroyed mandala far exceeded the museum workers' expectations. Upon seeing the line that had formed outside, the staff called in law enforcement in fear of a stampede. As the scheduled time for distributing the sand came and went, people in the queue began to grumble that there wouldn't be enough for everyone anyway. Some countered that if one had paid their respects to Otosho Baksha, they had already received the benefits the mandala bestowed. Unsurprisingly, such assurances did little to thin the queue. An older Buryat man standing in front of me turned around and joked loudly to anyone in earshot. And here you have it, our Soviet Buddhism, like queuing for sausage. From the perspective of creating a Buryat variant of Buddhism, Inc., the mandala queue was irrational, an example of fetishism in both anthropological and Marxist senses. At the same time, the mandala reveals the Janus-like qualities of a cultural commodity produced for both internal and external consumption. Its assembly and disassembly were advertised as a cultural event, something to draw in tourists and a general secular public rather than worshippers, and its location in a museum space seemed to cement its availability to a general audience. However, because the mandala to the medicine Buddha addresses itself explicitly to corporeal embodied hopes and desires, its audience engaged it as a site of worship, or to be more specific, as a site of healing, and not as a museum exhibit. In so doing, it also revealed the limits of the commoditizing logic that underpin the folding of religion to the region's brand. So it is not an accident that the queue, with its reanimated memories of a Soviet mundane, centered on questions of medicine and healing. Since the late 1980s, the regional administration has been steadily invested in developing and promoting a local tradition of Buddhist medicine, locally known as simply Tibetan medicine, not only in order to monetize Buryatia's cultural and religious distinction, but also in order to create an additional viable medical resource for the local population. In this section, I shift the focus to the ways in which efforts to institutionalize and promote a version of Buryat Buddhist medicine creatively reconfigure what might constitute a Buryat brand and Buryat cultural identity. Rather than look towards a Benjaminian loss of authenticity of the mass-produced commodity form, or for the threat of dwindling natural resources that often underpin concerns over the commercialization of indigenous medicines, I'm interested in how experimentation with ethno-branding generates new ways of envisioning history, collectivity, and difference. So over the last 40 years, since the original project of investigating the legacy of Tibetan medicine was instituted at the local Academy of Sciences, the vision of what constitute those medical practices in Buryatia has undergone significant changes. Invoking the World Health Organization's repeated calls for a greater incorporation of local ethnomedicine into public healthcare, local scientists and medical professionals interested, either intellectually or financially, in the potential of traditional medicine, frequently insisted that Buryatia, in addition to having inherited Tibetan medicine with the spread of Buddhism, had the time to develop its own unique school. Despite these claims to the tradition's local uniqueness, doctors and practitioners often wistfully mentioned to me that the avenue for nationalizing Tibetan medicine in Buryatia, on the model of Chinese medicine in China, or traditional Chinese medicine in China, or Buddhist medicine in Mongolia, was not available to them. As one official quipped during the banquet part of the conference on Tibetan medicine in Ulan-Ude, quote, "I have suggested that we call the Buryat branch of Tibetan medicine the Tibeto-Indo-Perso-Greco-Mongolian Buryat medicine of Russia, but I was told that this is too long and just isn't catchy." At the same time, it is important to remember that Tibetan medicine, much like Buddhism, has now become a global commodity. One of the more controversial sites of this commercialization was the local branch of the International Academy of Traditional Tibetan Medicine, an organization that, as its name suggests, operates on a global scale and has the dual purpose of teaching Tibetan medicine to those able to afford it and promoting Tibetan medical culture more generally. ATTM's headquarters are housed in Milan, Italy, but the organization has a presence throughout Western and Eastern Europe, in the US, India, Japan, and China. The Russian central office is located in Moscow, but an offshoot opened in Ulan-Ude and quickly became a site of both concentrated interest and vitriolic controversy for the local Buddhist community. The office's main organizer, Ayur Lama, had big plans for expanding the organization. He hoped to organize a school of Tibetan medicine in the region that would derive profit from the intense labor of gathering medicinal herbs by rebranding it as ecotourism for wealthy foreigners and Muscovites. In the meantime, his primary activity centered on putting together meditation retreats organized around the spiritual side of Tibetan medicine, or Yutoknitik. According to other practitioners, so Tibetan medicine is actually tantric practice, right? So according to other practitioners of tantric traditions in Buryatia that I've spoken to, siddhi, or magical powers, in this case rejuvenation and healing, are an interesting but largely irrelevant byproduct of systematic tantric pursuits. As far as Ayur Lama's marketing strategies were concerned, they made for a perfect advertisement campaign for the retreats, in no small part because promises of rejuvenation were an already intensely familiar category of mostly cosmetic and medical products in Russia. While my local interlocutors in the Tibetan medicine community critiqued Ayur Lama for what they felt was cynical profiteering, the lectures that the organization put together were quite popular, despite high admission costs, and drew both practitioners and patients. As in other traditions of Buddhism, Tibetan medicine empowerment conveyed by a spiritual teacher authorized the student to undertake essential aspects of the craft. For example, the preparation of certain types of medicine, pulse divination, reading certain medical texts, and the meditative techniques associated with Tibetan medicine all require different levels of empowerment. As it was explained to me, the empowerment is a ritual action where the teacher claims karmic responsibility for the student. Because the organizers, so Ayur Lama and his crew, explicitly monetized the empowerment component by charging higher admission if one planned to stay until the end, which is when the empowerment would happen, participants quickly began to grumble about the improper intentions of the administration. For his part, Ayur Lama saw no contradiction at all in the way he was weaving Buddhist teachings with market logics. In a sense, it is possible to see Ayur Lama as embracing and inhabiting the familiar slippage between neoliberalism and New Age spirituality, a rhetoric of self-perfection aimed at cultivating market success and a cultivation of market success as a form of spiritual self-fashioning. However, such an interpretation would offer only a partial picture. In a remarkably Marxist reading of his entrepreneurial activities, Ayur Lama explained that money was simply the concentrated energy that one had expended to earn it. In other words, he argued Buddhist protectors of Sakyusan actually consumed labor power, and a high price tag was simply a way to pay respect to the Buddhist deities involved in one's practice. He felt irate with the financial reluctance of the audience he had gathered, accusing them of being improper Buddhists, still plagued by a Soviet mentality of wanting to reap the benefits without quite literally working for it. So Ayur Lama wasn't alone in noting and mobilizing the intersection of Buddhism, markets, and local anxieties for the embodied histories and after effects of the Soviet state. For those who, most of their lives, lived in what is often locally glossed as Soviet times or the Soviet period, a personal history of a shortage of spiritual practices has very concrete and dire implications for prospects of a good rebirth, which explains why Ayur Lama actually had this following of grandmothers. In the everyday, this translates into an embodied temporality experienced as biological time running out. So referring to what one's life was like during socialism, which is to say articulating continuities and discontinuities within a single lifespan, presents a comparable challenge to stringing together lifetimes and rebirths. During our conversation about reincarnation and what constitutes a desirable rebirth, Bayar Lama, a talented tanka painter in one of the city's temples, chuckled when I asked him, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, whether he knew what he had been in a previous life. Of course I know. I was a photographer. But for those of an older generation who do not have much of a chance at a second post-socialist life, what matters is a lifetime accumulation of favorable karma interrupted by political and historical events that does not bode well for future chances of a positive corporeality. Older people older people are especially vulnerable in this calculus of time. The grandmothers, as Ayur Lama affectionately yet somewhat patronizingly called the older women who were ready to brave hours of queuing to receive the material aspect of a blessing or empowerment, and who constituted his primary client base, are terrified of getting permanently lost in Bardo, the intermediate state between reincarnations. It is in relation to this contingent finality that accumulating empowerments, blessings, and sacred objects becomes a way of trying to catch up to an ineluctable karmic calculus that does not make excuses for the accident of birth. My point then is that the activities and relative success of such religious organizations as ATTM in Buryat might first appear as the symptom of a kind of universal translatability of a global, cosmopolitan, and market-oriented Buddhism. But this is not the whole picture, and arguably not a very helpful one. In Buryat, such explanations would fail to account for how configurations of religious self-improvement, spirituality, and markets are in fact co-opted and repurposed within distinctly post-socialist Buddhist logics of managing historically fractured temporalities. Okay, so in conclusion, this paper has suggested that rather than transforming everything it touches into prospective economic gain, the ethno-brand, or more specifically the varied project that it mobilizes, work in Buryat as alternatively a way of staking out the region's political connections, a site for the articulation of cultural distinction, and an optic for the production of moral and symbolic value, as well as a meta-commentary on the nature of political change. And it is to this latter point that I would like to return in my conclusion. What makes the accusation of Sovietness such a productive metaphor in local discourses on the encounter between Buryat Buddhism and the market? The juxtaposition of banality and desirability, so starkly captured in the analogy with a sausage queue, appears to make religious commodities, whether empowerments or ritual objects, a site of reflection on the nature of post-Soviet life itself. By way of illustration, it may be helpful to go to one of the most widespread pejorative terms employed to describe former Soviet subjects and the quality of Soviet existence. Savok or Savkovy, substituted for Sovietsky, is a play on words that transformed Soviet into Savok or dustpan, scoop, or trowel. While some debates exist about the etymological origins of neologism, and I'm not going to go into that right now, what interests me here is that the pejorative connotation appears to be partially a function of the term's almost profane prosaicness. Savok is a critique because, among other things, it defines the Soviet experience as the constant coexistence between lofty utopian aesthetics and rhetorics and the dull tedium of everyday housekeeping. Perhaps ironically, in everyday parlance, Savok sometimes comes to stand in for petit bourgeois ambitions, values, and tastes. In my conversations with people from an older generation for whom queuing had been, and often still is, an integral part of the everyday economy of obtaining goods and services, certain objects were taken to be iconic of what it means to live in Soviet times, or what it meant to live in Soviet times. They often invoked with equal measure ironic amusement and puzzlement a list of commodities remarkable for their banality, yet no less passionately coveted: sausage, vodka, shoes, nylon stockings. In these overtones of the Soviet scarce commodity as uniquely profane fetish that helps, it is this overtones of the Soviet scarce commodity as uniquely profane fetish that helps people make sense of the local circuits of post-socialist Buddhism. So the queue for the sand mandala, with its inherent contradictions, a material abundance or of sacredness offset by a pedestrian experience of a material scarcity, helps lay bare some of the productive tensions that characterize the commoditization of religious and cultural practices in Siberia. Attending to the accumulation of karmic benefit while running against the biological clock is part of a broader temporality of fractalized lifetimes that do not readily or obviously map onto particular lifespans. Unsurprisingly, Ayur Lama was particularly sensitive to these eternal biographic rifts. In my past life as a good Soviet citizen, he liked to joke, I graduated from the Pedagogical Institute and did a stint as a physics teacher in Aginsk. Now I teach Buddhism, but actually knowing how to explain physics to a bunch of village kids is really helpful. I heard a variation of the story on a regular basis from a variety of Buddhist practitioners, both Buryat and Russian. The uncomfortable suturing that helps maintain a coherent lifetime becomes a site for making historical and political arguments. For example, those critical of the leader of Buryatia's Buddhist Sangha, Dakpa Yoshev, frequently took his ready involvement in local politics as a testimony of the improper holdover of his Soviet non-religious life on his new post-socialist incarnation as a religious figure. And so distinctions between proper and improper lives, ones that are too tarnished by Soviet histories or by neoliberal market logics, for example, miss the more subtle ways of strategizing and living within and across lifetimes in post-socialist Buryatia. The liminal mixture proliferated by the logics of the ethno brand or of Buddhism Inc. have their own unique efficacies. The sand from the Odisha mandala, for example, worked as a portable agent of the sacred, harnessing karmic benefit into the everyday. The packets of blessed sand could be incorporated into the walls of a house, hung from the rear view mirror of a car, or worn as amulets to heal the body and extend biological lifetimes. The practices of Yutok Nitik that the controversial ATTM branch advertised to Asian Buddhists could help extend a lifetime where properly following the Dharma had been jeopardized by a state-imposed atheism. In the intimate interstices of everyday life, the commoditized practices of Buryat Buddhism have little care for economic futures. They're harnessed to add time to present life, and thus, in the long run, maximize lifetimes of opportunity for bridging historical transitions, whether within this lifetime or the next. Thank you.
Were there no Buddhist practitioners who rebelled against commercialism? It sounds like a situation designed to produce reaction.
Were there practitioners who rebelled against commercialism? Is that what you're asking, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes and no. Sorry. Yes and no. I mean, there was certainly very vitriolic debates within the community, the Buddhist community, and especially the Tibetan medicine community, about who was a legitimate practitioner, right? Like who was authentic and who was just faking it. But that doesn't mean that the ones who were authentic weren't participating in market logics. They were, right? It's just the way in which they were participating varied. So one place that, so specifically two, because mostly I worked in Tibetan medicine, so there were two places that I saw this. One was when practitioners would say that the Amchi, the sort of Tibetan medicine practitioners who imported formulas from India or Tibet or China, as opposed to making them from the ground up, were fakes, right? They weren't authentic. Or they were just lazy, kind of commercially oriented profiteers, right? Another place, as opposed to, and there was of course practitioners who didn't do that and who made formulas by collecting wild crafting plants, etc. But the trick with that, of course, is that Tibetan medical formulas originally were designed in 12th century Tibet, right? So it's a very, very different ecological assemblage, which means that to get the ingredients, you need to cultivate transnational, sort of like, commercial networks that allow you to get the proper ingredients to create this authentic formula. So it's kind of like you can't disentangle yourself out of this sort of commodity logic. But, I guess that your question is like, were there people who were actually actively protesting against this? And was there an ideology of non-commercialization? For sure, absolutely. And then another place, there was another, and the other example escaped me, but I hope that answers you.
Following up on that, I'd like to hear more about missionaries from outside in Mongolia teaching Buddhism to the Buddhists there, such as Lama Olenaido. I'd like to hear more about him. I know
right.
He's a colorful character.
Right. He is a very colorful character. So Olenaido has come to regularly visited Buryatia, from what I know. So I mean, every couple of years, he would show up and he would mobilize this, very similar to this ATTM thing, right? He would mobilize the local Buddhist community, and everyone, like literally everybody, would show. And they would critique him, right? Like they would be really frustrated. to, and some people, not everybody, but so there's these internal sort of rifts that also are along the lines of which teachers one follows, and whether one considers Tibetan Buddhism in the Tibetan diaspora living in Buryat more authentic or less authentic with the Buryat version. So there's all these internal myths. In relation to other kinds of missionaries, it's interesting that in relation to Buddhist missionaries, there was a lot less suspicion and kind of rejection than in relation to Christian missionaries, who, especially American ones, who regularly showed up in Buryat as well, and were kind of the object of all kinds of anxieties and controversy. So it's interesting that not all missionaries have the same status, or we were even sort of read in the same way.
Sure. Now remember, it's modernism.
Right.
It's downplayed
right.
the queuing line for ritual blessings.
Yeah.
That is an alternative to this homegrown form of post-Soviet Buddhism.
Right. I mean, the thing is, all of them showed up and all of them had the same effects, right? This is like the queue was this just constant effect, right? No matter who it was. Yeah. So it was just, and it was specifically in relation to the sense of scarcity, right? That historical scarcity that you need to catch up. So people critiqued, but they still showed up just in case, right? Yeah, so, yeah. Oh, sorry. I think you had the mic.
Thank you, Tatiana. I just wanted to ask, again, kind of following the same track of questions, about the commodification and the monetization. You said something very interesting, that it cannot be reduced to this easy story of the juxtaposition of this neoliberalism on the one hand and this New Age spirituality, which kind of a very facile explanation which we hear from all over the world. Yeah. And that here is very particular arguments he's constructing to do with money and commodity fetishism, and it struck me that maybe there's a very particular post-Soviet form of knowledge, because Marxism and the very complex understanding of fetishism and of the power of the fetish and of what is being obscured by it, right? The kind of powerful history of the commodity.
Right.
And how money can be seen as not necessarily a form of capital, but also a form of accumulated energy. Yeah. Which, of course, in Soviet Marxism was very much debated. So I'm just very curious if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't think, I think Yurla Master, this fellow that I'm talking about, was the one who made the statement the most kind of obviously, and the one who explicitly connected it to Marxism, right? So it was into commodity fetishism, etc. But the logic is there, in the sense that there is something about both socialism and Buddhism and that interaction, in that question of materiality, that's definitely there. One of the, and that's like a famous debate or a famous anthropological object that people who work in Buryat notice are debates over vodka, and whether vodka is, whether you should be using a ritual vodka to donate to the spirits, right? First of all, whether you should be using vodka in the first place, and whether that affects the spirits, and whether a transmutation of the alcohol actually happens, or if they are getting drunk. And the other question was whether you should be buying cheap vodka or not. and exactly, the logic was exactly the same, that if you are buying cheap vodka, you are not investing kind of your labor power in it, right? So you're therefore trying to cheat the spirits, which is, or the Buddhist secusans, which, and of course they know, right? so it's definitely there. I'd have to think a little bit more about how that connects specifically to Buddhism, right? Because it's also, you see this logic in shamanism too. So it's interesting that that's there. Does that maybe get?
Maybe also Christianity,
right, the sort of transmutation question. Yeah.
Going back to the earlier question about outside missionaries, didn't the Dalai Lama visit Buryat, or am I wrong about that?
So there's been a lot of, I can't remember if, I think he did at some point. Although he hasn't been able to visit in many, many years. And the Russian government is like, this is a constant sort of point and an issue of debate, whether the federal government will allow it or not. Over the last years, that has not happened. And in part, that has to do with China, that Russia doesn't want to get it sort of, spoil its relationship with China. And they think that by letting the Dalai Lama visit, this would be an issue. There's also kind of tensions between, some of the tensions between the Sangha and the Dalai Lama, but the Sangha hasn't always been particularly positive about the Dalai Lama either, right? So, because exactly they're trying to create this like autocephalic.
Like currently there's like a discourse that like American Buddhist organizations are conspiring to control the reincarnation of the Small Khan of Mongolia will be coming out very rapidly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah. So there's, it's a contentious issue.
I had a point about materiality stuff. Something I picked up on in Mongolia is like the sort of novelty of materials people are using. So for example, in 2012, there was this, I think just a period of a couple of months where like at Ganden in Ulaanbaatar, there was like hell money, Chinese hell money, and like I've never seen that there since, or before then. And this summer, like the big thing was like, very colorful, very sort of artificial, chemically smelling arts, like incense. And again, I've like never seen that. And people I was with were also, commenting on the novelty of the item. So I'm just wondering if maybe that's a dynamic also at play here and what that would be.
So I haven't seen art. I haven't seen fake incense. And of course, this this sort of blend between the mass-produced, right, and the authentic. Like that whole Benjaminian logic of the mass production leads to the loss of aura. Just doesn't work here, right? Because that prayer wheel that you stick on your dashboard, even though it's plastic made in China, right, or sort of mass produced in China, it still works, right? It actually doesn't matter. It harnesses something, right?
It's like a technology.
It's a technology, right? It's a technology to harness kind of this karmic benefit, and people think of this as, people do think that there's maybe more authentic objects, especially around the logic of blessing. So my sense is that a lot of the debates that I've heard, at least when I was there, are around transmutations, right? So you can have a kitschy kind of mass-produced tanka, right? And then if a powerful teacher consecrated it in some ways, then that's fine, right? And people would go to these environments and sort of like bring something to be consecrated, and it's literally something that you might have found in your pocket, right? And so there's this sort of, there isn't that much of, there's concern about the materiality, but it's not that primary part. It's not the Benjaminian logic is what I'm trying to say. It's not about that kind of fake. Right. That's just not the concern.
I just wanted to make a comment following this, but I also noticed that during the talk. In fact, Benjamin is not arguing that the mass production leads to the loss of aura. He's talking about the displacement of aura to another location, right? And it's actually very similar to the argument about commodification. The aura gets sort of embedded into the commodity, or in politics, right? Like in mass media. So it's not like authentic versus fake. That's not his argument. He's actually against that argument. Right. I hear that interpretation. It's kind of one which floats around, but that's not.
No, that's really helpful. Yeah, that's really helpful.
So, thank you again.
Thank you.